Hey y'all, I am so excited to have you here for the Sunny Spot. Tonight, I'm excited for part two of our discussion with climate change. And today we're going to go over the movie Don't Look Up. And um, I have Kyle with me again from last week. And now I also have Chris Lay, who assisted him with the book. The article, excuse me. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the Sunny Spot on Skeptic Haven.
Jefferson laid great stress on it. It wasn't enough, he said, to enshrine some rights in a Constitution or a Bill of Rights. The people had to be educated, and they had to practice their skepticism and their education. Otherwise, we don't run the government. The government runs us.
Hey everyone, I'm so glad that you decided to join us on Thursday. You could be anywhere else, but you're here with us and we appreciate that. I want to welcome my two guests. First of all, Dr. David Kyle Johnson. We just call him Kyle. How are you doing?
Good, I'm doing good. Sunny, how are you?
I am doing great. I've been looking forward to our part two of the show we had. So thank you for coming on back.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I also have Chris Lay. Now, Chris, I am not as familiar with you. What would you like for our audience to know about you?
Well, I guess I don't have a whole lot to say. I teach philosophy at a small college in North Georgia called Young Harris College. I'm, I guess, a metaphysician, if you wanted to peg down what I really do. But that means that I'm going to interact with a lot of different other areas of philosophy. I'm going to talk about moral questions, because if you're starting to answer things like what constitutes a person, that means I'm going to have to deal with, well, what makes a person morally valuable, who's morally valuable, and so on. So all that kind of comes up. And I also deal primarily with the philosophy of popular culture. And like Kyle, I try to discuss the ways in which pop culture actually makes philosophical arguments. So not just we can understand philosophy through these things, but I think the people who are making films and television shows and video games have something to say that can teach us something philosophically. And I try to demonstrate that in the things that I teach.
You're muted, Sunny. You're muted.
I didn't even know I was muted. When did that happen? That's okay.
I'm sure it's Wes's fault. Go ahead.
I'm going to blame Wes, even though it probably wasn't. I'm just going to blame him because he's easy to blame. And if I didn't do something silly on a show, it wouldn't be the Sunny Spot. Let's just be real.
But what were you saying? What was your reply to Chris's articulation there?
I was saying that is extremely fascinating. I know I'm going to really enjoy the show just hearing that. And I might even want you on the show again another time to talk about other topics.
Absolutely. Anytime.
All right. So before we jump in.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Before we jump in, I wanted to read some of the comments from last week. We asked the question, what are you doing to help fix the climate crisis? And we had a couple really good answers. Carrie Ann Chrysler said, I utilize rainwater, shop locally once a month. I grow some food myself. I have an on-demand water heater and energy-efficient appliances. Switch to LED lights where possible. Heat with wood using fallen trees. Gosh, that's a lot, and that's great. You're awesome. Alma said, I'm reusing the water for the laundry to clean floors, and she planted 5 trees. Whoop, whoop. Awesome. And Theo said, I don't use AC if not urgently needed. Don't drive for small distances. Turn power and lights off whenever possible, and use power-efficient cooking. See, we can all make a difference in whatever ways that we have at our disposal. So fantastic.
One of the things to remind listeners, though, that we talked about last time in reply to that stuff, that both, I forget the name of the guy that was on last week. You remember?
If you would have not said that, I would have remembered.
I was fascinated by him. He was a wonderful guest, and I feel really bad for forgetting his name after just a week.
Well, how do you think I feel? I'm the host.
Right, he was very, very active in literally legislation. He knows a lot of climate scientists who are working on actual, climate science. He was also active in legislation in, I believe, Minnesota, and they had made some major progress on efforts with climate change. And one of the things that we both agreed on was that while individual efforts like the ones that you just listed are magnificent and wonderful, this is something Chris and I talk about in the article, even collectively, if everyone's doing things like that, it's not going to be enough to mitigate climate change. And it is a systemic process. Greg was his name. Thanks, Wes.
Yes, Greg Ladden. I'm sorry, Greg.
But like systematic, fundamental, government-wide, worldwide change needs to be made in order to really tackle the crisis. Even everyone doing their little bit will not be enough to mitigate it. There has to be major changes on a grandiose scale in order for the problem to actually be solved. So that's one of the points that we make in the article, is that we don't want to fool ourselves into thinking that we don't have to do anything on a governmental level. We can solve this on the individual level. It's in the same way that a comet's not going to be solved on an individual level, right? Climate change is not going to be solved by any individual or collective individual action.
Collectively individualistic. No, you're absolutely right. I think it does two things. It keeps us, by doing things ourselves, it keeps us focused on solutions, trying to be solution focused and trying to continue to push forward. And it also just makes us feel better.
Yeah, it does. Sure.
So, and we're also not, at least we're not contributing. Right. At least we're not.
Right. Yeah, we're not making the problem worse. 100%. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So
tonight we're going to be talking about Don't Look Up.
Right. I was going to say, to move us into that, I have a way to maybe transition us into that topic.
By all means.
So, and it also provides a little background for kind of what we're doing here. So, and maybe be interest to listeners. Chris and I have worked on a number of different projects together. He co-wrote a chapter of my Black Mirror book, and then we ended up, like, while I was working on the book, new episodes came out, and Chris and I ended up collaborating on a Choose Your Own Adventure chapter for the Choose Your Own Adventure episode of Black Mirror called Bandersnatch.
Wow.
If you've watched Bandersnatch, it's a Choose Your Own Adventure, Netflix thing, and you can guide your way. We designed and wrote a Choose Your Own Philosophical Adventure chapter for that book. That was lots of fun to write. I laid out the details. Chris wrote all the endings and a few of the transitions, and I wrote the intro, and it all worked together. It was lots of fun, really, really fun chapter. It's even got it's got 5 different endings. Chris wrote 5 different endings for it. On the audiobook, there's literally 2 different versions of that chapter that take you down 2 different paths to 2 different endings. Wow. But even that is not enough because there's 3 other endings that it doesn't have. So, but I was so impressed with Chris's writing that I invited him to write the Black Mirror chapter for my Palgrave Handbook, which there's a picture of it on the lower left here of my screen. Which the Palgrave Handbook does what Chris was talking about a while ago, which is treats pop culture as philosophy, as something that's making a philosophical argument. And so he wrote the Black Mirror chapter for that. And I think that was the first one that you wrote. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, right. So, but he's so stinking good. He is such a good writer and editor that once I pulled my head out of my butt and realized that I was not going to be able to do the project alone, it ended up being 96 chapters. I invited Chris along with Dean and Kimberly. You can see there on the cover to co-edit with me. Basically, we're all editors of the project. And I cannot thank Chris enough for the amount of work that he put into the project. And so he handled a whole bunch of the chapters in the book. But one of the things as we were working on it, we decided that we wanted to do was we were both enamored with Don't Look Up, this movie that came out while I was working on the book. When the book first was being worked on, it didn't exist, but it came out while we were working on it. And I emailed Chris and was like, have you seen this? I don't remember the exact sequence of events, but have you seen this? Yes. So we started talking about it. We need to write a chapter for the handbook about this. The movie is too important. It's too misunderstood. And so that's what we did. And we ended up with like a 20,000 word giant chapter. But I use it in class. And I'm hoping other people use it in class, but that's our collaboration here. And so that's why we're on talking together here, because we both, I basically wrote the intro, not the intro. I wrote the first half of the chapter. Chris wrote the second half of the chapter. And so we can talk about the different elements of the chapter in that way. But that's why we're here together.
Fantastic. That's awesome. Chris, before I go on, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to say whatever you need to say about that or want to say about that. Do you have anything you want to add to what Kyle said?
Honestly, I'm just floored by Kyle's unnecessary flattery there. I really don't know what to say. He was just so full of compliments. when he reached out about the chapter, I actually hadn't seen the film yet. So he said, like, hey, here's this movie. We've got to do something about it. And I barely heard anything about it at that point. I'm pretty sure it came out during sort of the down period, like the winter break. And, I keep my head down during that time, just trying to juggle family and all of that. And so he sends the email and I think, oh, I got to watch this so that I know something about it and feel like I can write. And the second I watched, I don't know, let's say 20 minutes of it, I had an idea of how philosophically important it was going to be. So I was delighted that he'd reached out and asked me to collaborate again. It's been awesome working with him every time.
Fantastic. Well, what a great thing. First of all, the two of you together sounds like quite a dynamic duo. And before we go on, just really quickly, you have those two things that you just talked about. You said that you've worked on several. What are some of the other things you guys have worked together on?
I think collaboration wise, it was like when we both have our name on it, it's the Bandersnatch chapter, the Don't Look Up chapter, and then just the handbook in general.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay.
But Chris also, as I mentioned before, contributed to another chapter in Black Mirror. But then you have how many chapters in the handbook? You got?
I think it's 3. I've got the Black Mirror chapter. I've got a chapter on Cyberpunk 2077, and I have a chapter on Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Right.
Our
collaboration. And then Don't Look Up. Right. The Zelda chapter. It's so good. It's so good. You would not think that you'd be able to do what you do with Zelda, and it's really good. If any Zelda fans out there, we won't talk about it, but any Zelda fans out there, go look it up. Just look up Chris Lay, Breath of the Wild. If you can't figure out how to get it for free, email me. I'll send you a copy. But it's very, very good. But
thank you.
Yep.
Cool. Fantastic. So you said that you had seen or heard about this movie. I don't know, Kyle, if you had actually seen it at the same time. Chris hadn't seen it yet. I don't know if you had seen it yet or if you just heard about it. And then you immediately thought, we need to do something about this. Tell me a little bit more about that. What were you thinking? What was the spark?
Yeah, so we can start getting to the chapter at this point. So because that's part of the spark is part of what motivated the chapter, obviously, and part of what I wrote about in my part of the chapter. So the movie is about, it's an analogy for climate change. It is about 2 astrophysicists basically who or astronomers, I guess, who discover a comet and then do the calculations and realize the comet's going to hit Earth. And the comet is like extinction level. It's not going to kill all life on Earth, but it's going to probably kill all human life on Earth. And so they try to make the government aware of it so they might be able to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And they attempt to do this, but it fails, right? Like, it's this very strange movie where, to me, it's very serious at the beginning. It's like Armageddon, right? Like, it's, asteroid on the way. We're all going to die. We got to get somebody on this or whatever. And they get to the White House and they rush them to the White House. And then there's like a birthday party. And there's some kind of kerfuffle politically about a Supreme Court nomination. And they put him off and they put him off and they put him off. And then when they finally get into the Oval Office, they kind of brush it off and say, well, we shouldn't say it's 99% sure. We should say it's 70% sure. And we'll just sit tight and assess and see what we right. And they don't come up with it. And you think it's really serious. And then there's this comedic opening credit that sounds, it's clearly like intended to be a comedy, but I'm not laughing at all yet. And then this series of events happens where they keep not doing stuff about something that's clearly an existential threat. And it's never funny because the way that people react is kind of how you would imagine what would happen in the real world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so, long story short, we could talk more about if it's a satire, failed satire, how all that works. But what I realized was that this was an analogy for climate change and how we're completely bungling the response to climate change. And it is so on point regarding how well it articulates how we are bungling it and how good the analogy works with that. That I was like, well, this is the climate change movie I've been waiting for. Like, I have been wanting to talk about climate change in class using pop culture, but I could never really find anything that was really good about it, right? Like, you've got things like the day after tomorrow and that kind of stuff that completely understands the science and that kind of stuff. And this is just an analogy. You don't have to get the science right. It's more about like, this is how we're screwing it up. And it literally has a song like, listen to the goddamn qualified scientists, right? Like getting at the right stuff. And so I was like, oh, we've got to write on that. So that's when I emailed Chris. It's like, have you seen this thing? And I knew that he would have a good take on it once he viewed it, and wanted his take on what he thought the argument was, because I was having trouble putting that down, if memory serves anyway. You want to add to that, Chris?
Yeah, sure. So first, the tiniest of corrections. I do not know how you take Armageddon seriously when within the first like 15 minutes, Ben Affleck is like trailing animal crackers down Liv Tyler's body. There's a character named Rockhound. But okay, yeah, we'll set that aside.
So true.
It's not a comedy, right? Like when Armageddon hit, it's clearly not a Mel Brooks movie, right? Where you're like, oh,
no, for sure.
Right? It's
and like to your point, like this is Adam McKay. He's got a history of things like Talladega Nights, Step Brother. Even when he started to get a little more serious with, say, Vice, that movie is still clearly intended as a comedy. Halfway through, the credits roll when we are supposed to take it that Dick Cheney has this major turnaround and suddenly starts supporting his lesbian daughter, if I remember correctly, how the film plays it. And they're all hugging. And yeah, that's obviously played for laughs, as are a lot of other scenes there. But there were very few times in this movie, to Kyle's point, where I'm laughing. Honestly, I had this sense of anxious dread from almost moment one.
Right.
So yeah, it's this curious movie that you look at the cast, you look at the people behind it. It's supposed to be a comedy, but you're not laughing, and you're not even sure that you're supposed to be laughing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So the way I explain it in the chapter, the reason it has that effect, I think, is because part of what Chris is talking about is this tension, like the world's going to end and you don't want it to end, and no one's doing what they can to prevent it from ending. And the way that people are failing so directly mirrors the way that they have already failed in the real world that it's not funny, right? So the point I make is like satire works when satire is an exaggeration. The example I use in the chapter is the church lady from old Saturday Night Live, right?
Yeah.
Church lady is a satire of actual ladies that went to church with Dana Carvey when he was growing up. And that's kind of how they behaved. They didn't behave exactly like that. It wasn't as outrageous as they did as that, right? But it's an exaggeration of the way and that's why it's funny, is because it's an exaggeration. All imitations and that kind of stuff, when people do impressions and that kind of stuff, that's what it works. They're exaggerations. So for satire to work as comedy, it's got to be an exaggeration. The problem with Don't Look Up is it's not an exaggeration, right? It's just like, oh, yeah, all the things that these people are doing that are just dumb. I've seen people do all of those things, right? Like, the president's son says that if he wasn't, if the president wasn't his mother, he would want to have sex with her. Well, Donald Trump said that about his own daughter, right? That's not funny. That actually happened, right? Talk about, like, I don't know, I could go on and on about all the things and the way the science is degraded and that kind of stuff. And so it's like the only time I think I laughed in the entire film was there's about 2 minutes where they launch the mission to go save everything, right? And it's successful. Like all of the rockets go off. They have they state hey, we have a 95% probability of success at this point. And you take a sigh of relief, and Jonah Hill, who has been dogging the Lawrence, the Jennifer Lawrence character the entire time, saying she's ugly or whatever, gives her a big kiss, right? Like, and it's horrible. And she's just like, hell, right? It's this horrible, like she's, and it's like obviously like this idiot who thinks she's ugly really is attracted to her, and he's a jerk and blah blah blah. And it's like moderately funny for that long, and then they turn back the mission, and then it's just not funny anymore, right? Because it's kind of like, and they turn back the mission because they realize they might be able to make money off of the comet, right? And you're like, yeah, that's not funny because that's what we would do.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Every single thing in there in that film, I was going, oh my God, we are dead. I mean, this is real life. It's real life. We're just dead. If it's not politically expedient or profitable, it just is what it is. We'll all say goodbye to life. That's exactly what I felt, which isn't funny. And yet I enjoyed the movie, and I didn't feel it wasn't like I was watching it and it was necessarily depressing during. I mean, I didn't feel like it was a downer, like like an apocalyptic movie, with the whole darkness.
Right.
It was a downer, but it didn't have that feel. You could still smile, I guess.
Yeah, I think this might be a good point. This kind of jumping to the end, but I think you can do this without ruining anything, Chris. Explain, you came up with the subtitle of like the popcorn's not free, right? Like I forget is that the exact subtitle, right?
The snacks aren't free.
Yeah, the snacks aren't free. Climate change and why the snacks aren't free, right? And in conjunction with it being a popcorn movie or not a popcorn movie.
So I will say that I did find myself laughing a lot throughout the movie, unlike Kyle, but it was this manic laughter where, like, I don't know how else to respond, so I'm going to laugh at the absurdity of the situation.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the same laughter that I had growing up watching these 90s kind of gross out comedies. It was very different. I was uncomfortable, and I'm like, oh, all I can do is laugh because this is too real. But to the subtitle, the snacks aren't free. And to whether or not this is kind of a popcorn movie or not. I think that this is a movie that is made for basically anybody to watch. It has to be accessible because of what it ends up doing with its philosophical argument. It's not going to be a very good argument if only 5 people can understand it. So it's got to be something that everybody can watch and clearly and plainly understand. But, at the same time, with its argument, it has to be doing something that makes you uneasy. That is over and above what a popcorn movie would do. Like, popcorn movies don't typically do that. At the end of a popcorn movie, let's say this is a popcorn movie, like the movie that Chris Evans films within the movie in a movie that's about the comet hitting Earth. That movie is presumably going to end like Armageddon did. They save the Earth. It's great. Everybody learns their lesson. And I don't think anybody who walks out of the theater is going to actually learn a lesson from something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be a little bit of a downer. I know some of you say that like you didn't have this sense that it was a downer. It didn't put you in a bad mood. Maybe it didn't make you feel melancholy or whatever afterwards. And that's probably true, but certainly it didn't have an ending that just made you walk away from it and forget it. And in
You're
general,
exactly right.
I think that's what popcorn movies do. And I love popcorn movies. I love talking about them. I love watching them. But like popcorn is a snack that you eat and it doesn't really have any nutritional value or much value beyond the flavor at the moment. That's a popcorn movie.
Mm-hmm.
But this movie stuck with me.
Yes, it did me too. And while you were saying that, I was thinking I didn't feel down, but at the same time, the thing I said was, "Oh, we're all dead. We are just dead because this is too real." So it's almost like schizophrenic in a sense in how you think about it, because you guys are so spot on. Sorry.
There's kind of an implied conditional there. Like, we're all dead if we don't do something. We're all dead if we keep doing what we've been doing, which is what the movie depicts, right? Notice that you can't, I'm kind of saying the same thing Chris did, but in a slightly different way. Notice that you couldn't come away with that conclusion if this ended like Armageddon, where in the day they figure out how to save the day and they stop the comet and it's okay, right? Especially if, like, in the end, the Bash mission to mine it is successful somehow and they save the world or whatever, right? If the movie ends,
that would suggest to you that Elon Musk is going to save the world and take care of things through Twitter and SpaceX and Tesla and Neuralink and 100 other companies. So yeah,
right. And notice that would be the message of the film. If it ended that way, it would be, don't worry about climate change. We'll technology our way out of it, right? Elon Musk will save us. That's who the Peter Isherwell character in the movie is, basically Elon Musk. And they were making fun of him before he took on Twitter and made even more of a fool of himself than he has in the last couple of years. And that's another one of the messages of the movies, is technology. That we're not going to be able to, like, technology is going to be integral in solving the problem, but not in the kind of, we'll just geoengineer our way out of this. We'll just invent some technology that pulls the carbon out of the atmosphere, right? That's not the kind of technology that's going to solve this, right? And it's going to take sacrifices on our part and that kind of stuff to actually do it. But to Chris's point, like, it's not only is it forgettable, right, if it has a kind of Armageddon ending, but it completely undermines the message, Like the only thing that gets this, this movie's message across is we all die in the end, right? Including the rich people who try to fly away, who think that their money can save them, right? And they end up on another planet 22,000 years later, and they're all eaten by Bronterocs, right? Like they're not going to escape it either. They might think that they can by building their bunkers and da-da-da-da. But in the end, when society collapses because of climate change, they're not going to survive either.
Right.
Well, that's where the subtitle comes in, right? So in the film, you have several characters. You have the Jennifer Lawrence character and the Leonardo DiCaprio character. So Randall Mindy, right? That's Leonardo DiCaprio, and then Kate DiBiase and Teddy. These characters are at the White House, and a general tells them that, oh, just pay me for the snacks. Essentially, they're hungry. They're sitting. They're waiting to see the president, and he says, "Just pay me for the snacks." And it's this weird kind of undercurrent for the film that I think on a first viewing probably makes you go, "Why is this here?" Right? Where they have to pay him, then they find out, oh, the snacks are free, and Kate is just consistently like, why is he charging us for this? This is a 3-star general. Why does he want us to pay $20 for the snacks? And ultimately, like as a viewer, this is not a film where you can just watch it and laugh about it around the dinner table with a couple of beers or something and walk away. The snack of the movie, it's not free. It weighs on you. It tells you something and commands something of you and tells you, if you don't listen to what I'm saying, you're a bad person. Like I genuinely think that the movie is condemning the viewer if they don't listen to its message. And that's where the snacks aren't free is coming from. Like movies are a snack for us most of the time, but this one costs something.
Right. And so on that level, like this might be a good point of conversation or whatever. The one thing that Chris and I disagreed just a little bit on in regards to interpreting the movie, and stop me if I'm wrong, Chris, and I don't even remember which one of us thought what. I forget which one of us had what. But there's two questions here, or two possibilities. Is the movie criticizing the viewer and the layperson, the ordinary individual, for not understanding climate change and not understanding that something needs to be done about it and not doing something about it and voting on some kind of other issue and not making it a top priority, et cetera, et cetera? Or is it not actually condemning the average individual, and instead is its criticism directed at the upper tier? And I say upper tier in the kind of the way that the movie outs it, but like the people with power, right? The Isherwells and the presidents and the scientists at the top, whatever, that have the power to manipulate the people below us, and that, like Isherwell, who are misinforming us on purpose for their own benefit, right? For their own financial gain, both short-term and long-term, and for just the power of it. Right. And this is where we kind of tie in the general who, again, who clearly doesn't need the money, but tricks, Jennifer Lawrence and Leo. I forgot their character's name off the top of my head. Mindy and DiBiase tricks them into paying for snacks that are actually free. Why would he need to do that? He doesn't need to do that. He's doing it just for the power. Right. And Isherwell and the president and are doing something very, very similar. And so we had this discussion. Is it really condemning the average person, or is it condemning the people with the power and the authority for misleading the average person, right? And the conclusion that we came into, might not be surprised, is it's doing both, right? It definitely has a lot of criticism for the people in power, but it is also laying a moral imperative on the viewer to say, regardless of who's in power, it is your obligation to be informed.
Absolutely. For those of you in the live chat, if you have a question for our two guests, please put it in there, and I will make sure that it's asked, and we will stop and go on to that. So please make sure and do that. If you are watching this later, please, in the comments, I would love to hear your take on what Kyle just said. Do you think it was a criticism of lay people? Is it a criticism of those in power? Is it a combination of the two? Or what is your take on that? Put that in the comments below. I look forward to hearing about that. So back to the paper that y'all did. I was looking just initially through the contents. this caught my eye immediately, the criticisms of Don't Look Up. And I'm really curious about that. Can you talk about the criticisms?
Yeah, so some of the criticisms were that it's not funny, right? Which we've kind of admitted that it's not that funny, right? So it doesn't work as satire, that kind of stuff. Another criticism was that it was too hard on those it criticized. So there were quotes from critics and stuff like that who were saying things like, "Hey, look at all the dum-dums," can't be a basis of social criticism, right? Or sophisticated social criticism. And so again, I think they're misunderstanding the movie if they think that's all it's saying, right? But that was one of the criticisms, right? Another was that it was too blunt. It was too on the nose. It was too obvious what it was doing. It's just obviously an analogy for climate change, and what it's doing is right. And there were some other criticisms along that line. There's a couple of ways of responding to those that I'll just briefly overview and see what you think, or see what viewers think, and get Chris's input as well. One is that, well, maybe three. Okay, so one is that it's not actually that overt, because it was very, very misunderstood. A lot of people thought it was just criticizing the dum-dums. It was actually criticizing people in power too, and people missed that. People thought that President Orlean was just a loose stand-in for Trump, right? And they missed the fact that A, she's a blonde woman, and B, she has a picture of Bill Clinton in her office. It's just as much as lampooning of Hillary. And if you look at Adam McKay and his political views, he was a Bernie supporter. He did not like Hillary, never has liked Hillary, and he's criticizing her just as much as he's criticizing Trump. And so it's not that blunt. So that's one. Two, even if it is blunt, what's wrong with that, right? We talk a little bit about this in the chapter about how there is this kind of pretentious notion that in order for art to be good art, it must be obscure and difficult to understand and hard to interpret, and only a few people can get it. And if you really think about it, then you can see what's going on, and yada, and that's what makes good art, right? And the reply is, we're not living in subtle times. Art does not need to be subtle. We need to be knocked over the head. And so it's okay if art comes along and every now and again and knocks people over the head, right? I've said that about when I wrote about the Orville. The Orville is not subtle. And I don't think Don't Look Up is either, but I don't think that makes it bad art, right?
Well, pragmatic terms, right? If I need a tool, I need to knock down a wall, I grab a claw hammer, and that's a more subtle tool, right? But the claw hammer isn't working, so eventually I have to reach for the sledgehammer because the wall's just not coming down without the sledgehammer.
Right.
I don't see why the same analogy can't be applied to our art. I'm right there with Kyle. I'm not sure that subtlety is always the hallmark of good art. It may often be,
sure,
but sometimes the message has to be delivered in a more explicit way, just as he says, because people aren't hearing it, they're not listening.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I mean, I think Inception's one of my favorite pieces of art. You talk about hard to interpret and figure out what the hell's going on there, right? But I mean, Inception's message is not all that important, not nearly as important as Don't Look Up, right? And so it deserves that blunt hand. Perfectly said, Chris. And then another kind of interesting controversy that was going on at the time was when critics were criticizing the movie. Adam McKay responded by saying that it seems like a lot of the criticisms are coming from people who do not appreciate the threat of climate change, the threat our democracy is in, and then the threat of climate change in general. And so it's like, I can understand if you don't think it's a threat, why you wouldn't think the movie is good or important. Because it would be like the analogy he used was like, it would be a robot watching a romantic comedy. Why are their faces so close together? Like you don't quite understand what's going on, right? The analogy I used in the article would be like, if you don't think climate change is a major threat, and then Don't Look Up, which is supposed to be an analogy about climate change that uses a comet that will kill all Earth, all life on Earth, would be like a movie that used mudslides as an analogy for the threats of World War III. Right? It's just not proportional, right? Like you have a movie about mudslides and it's clearly an analogy about the looming threat of World War III. That's kind of a weird movie. World War III and mudslides are very, very different kind of things, right? But if you appreciate that climate change actually is an existential threat to the species, just like a comet would be, the movie makes a lot more sense, right? And critics were saying, oh, no, I fully appreciate the threat of climate change. I just think it's a bad film, right? And there's kind of two things to say in response. If you look at the people who are making the criticisms and then saying, but I fully appreciate the threat of climate change, the way they tried to prove they appreciated it seemed to indicate that they didn't actually fully appreciate it, right?
Right.
They were saying things like, I fully appreciate the threat of climate change. I remember it was unseasonably warm last Christmas. Yes, it was. Right. And it was also due to climate change, but you're not really fully appreciating the problem here, right? A friend of mine was down on the movie, did not like the movie. He was like, but I appreciate climate change. And then in discussion with him, it was revealed that he didn't actually think it was an existential threat. Like it would be something that we just eventually learn to live with.
Right.
You're proving my point here, right? Like you don't fully appreciate the threat. And I think that's feeding into the reason that you don't, aren't appreciating the movie. And so one of the things I point out in the chapter is I go through a number of the critics who are making this point and show that it seems that they don't seem to understand don't understand the threat of climate change, and so why the analogy works so well, and thus why the movie is so important. Did you want to add something to that, Chris?
Well, really quickly before you do, I need to show we have a super chat from Jesus Tales. So thank you so much for your $5 super chat. That means the world to us. And Jesus has a question. Do we need more art that calls us to wake up? And would it be considered alarmist?
That's actually what I wanted to address, Sonny. I saw the question in the super chat and was like, ooh, this is a great question. Fantastic. I would tend to agree, Jesus Tales. I think that's right. We do need more art that calls us to wake up. And certainly there has been art in the past that pushes very firmly a position on people. There are those who would say that doesn't constitute art. I would pretty firmly disagree. This may not be the place to discuss that idea, but I would definitely disagree. I think we do need that kind of art. But as far as alarmist, I'm going to say no, simply because I think there's a really negative connotation with the notion of alarmist. If you call someone an alarmist, you're saying that they are jumping up and waving their hands about something that may not really be a problem. It's a boy who cried wolf kind of thing. That's the immediate analogy I think of. And certainly that's not the case with something that we genuinely need to wake up about. I'm not sure that there's a way to be alarmist about something that is a genuine problem, if people aren't responding to it, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great answer.
Let me contradict Chris while completely agreeing with him. So the question was, would it be considered alarmist, right? And it depends on how you interpret that question, right? In one way, of course it would, because deniers would insist that it was raising a problem about a problem that didn't exist. Like people who want to deny that climate change is real call anything that draws attention to climate change alarmist, right? So it would be called alarmist by deniers, et cetera, right? But would we call it alarmist? Right? Should we call it alarmist? Right? No, absolutely not, for exactly the reasons that Chris is articulating. Right? So, would it be alarmist? No, it would not actually be alarmist, because in the same way that a 5-alarm fire is not alarmist. If there's a fire, you got to ring the alarm. Right? That's not alarmism. Right? So it would not be alarmist because it would be raising raising attention to an actual serious problem. But definitely, some people would call it alarmism, and you'd have to be prepared to counter those kinds of claims.
Yep, absolutely. So going back to what we were talking about just a minute ago, you were talking about the criticisms so that people know where we were. And that's where the art came in. We were talking about that. The next thing that you talked about was, you talked about the media and the critics, but then you talked about the aptness. It's called the aptness of the climate change analogy. What do you mean by that?
Okay, good. And let me lay the groundwork. I want to talk about that, and then I want to talk about how Chris identifies what the argument of the movie is. Okay. So this can pull right very directly, because the analogy is very much part of that argument. So one of the criticisms was the analogy was not apt. The comet is totally different from climate change. That was the argument, right? And so the argument of the movie doesn't work because they're so different, right? It's supposed to be an argument for analogy, but the analogs are too different. And the way that it's different is like, climate change happens over a long period of time. but a comet, impact happens all at once. In the movie, the comet impact is coming in a couple of years. Climate change happens, off in the distance. I'm trying to think of some of the other. Let me actually look at the paper really quick and find those criticisms. Went too far. Here we go. So I'll just read a paragraph. In other words, the impact of the comet can be known for sure. The impact of climate change cannot, the argument says. A comet is quick, climate change is slow. Dealing with a comet wouldn't force us to change the way that we live. Dealing with climate change will force us to change the way we live. A comet kills everyone. Climate change affects everyone differently. We can adapt our way to deal with a comet impact, but we can adapt to climate change. That was the kind of arguments that people were making. I quoted somebody named Biddle that made that kind of argument. And the reason it doesn't work is because all of those things are false, right? Like, I mean, maybe the quick and slow thing, but that doesn't really change the aptness of the analogy. If instead it was a movie about a comet that was going to hit in 100 years, but we have to act right now to deflect it, which that's actually more likely how a comet would work. But if that movie would be less interesting, the analogy would be more apt, but nobody would, like all the other objections people like, that wouldn't make a difference. People would say the analogy still doesn't work. And so the reason the rest of it doesn't work is like a comet wouldn't force us to change the way we live, but dealing with climate change will. Well, actually in the movie, it does force us to change the way that we live. The analogy here is so nice. In the movie, people think that the comet has all of these minerals in it. And if we can mine those minerals, it's going to lead to this, Israel says it's going to lead to this like movement of no more poverty and prosperity for all of humanity, and everyone will be better off, et cetera. It's just like this huge, huge boon for all of humanity if we can do this. It's the same thing with oil, right? Our entire life is, mitigated on the way that oil works. And if we give that up, we're giving up, a major boon for our society. Same thing. If we give up the comet, we're giving up this supposed solution for poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So the analogy actually is spot on in the movie there, right? One of the other things was, we can adapt to a comet, but we can't adapt to climate change. No, we can't. We're not going to be able to adapt to 3 to 4 degrees warming by 2100. That is not something we're going to be able to adapt to. We have got to slow it down if we have any chance of being able to save the species and, the survival of the species long term, right? And so again, these people who are saying it doesn't work don't seem to fully appreciate the threat that climate change is. And that's why they think the analogy doesn't work when it actually does work for those reasons, right? And so does that answer your question, Sonny?
It absolutely does. And it's funny because as you were talking, I'm like, you were saying about us adapting to climate change. And I'm thinking, yeah, we adapt until we don't, which is very, very quickly, and then you went ahead and said that. And I keep looking away because my cat is being crazy. Like, oh my gosh, he's going to destroy things. So I just keep looking. And if all of a sudden everything falls apart, that's why. Keep talking.
Fair enough. Well, in that spirit, let me hand it over to Chris, who does a wonderful job of articulating what argument it makes and what philosophers he uses to make that clear. So please.
Well, I'll try to keep it as brief as I can, because I don't think anybody wants to hear somebody go through a bunch of Plato and Kant and Peter Singer for 20 minutes.
I do, but hey.
Sorry, I guess I'm just used to teaching a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds.
Yeah.
Well, from Plato, I take the idea that all philosophy really reduces to a kind of moral philosophy. And for Plato, doing the right thing, doing a good thing is knowing what to do. So if you have that knowledge, you're going to act well. If you act poorly, it's because you didn't know. You thought you were doing the right thing. You thought you were doing what's best for you or whatever. You just misunderstand. So we have that idea. From Kant, we have the idea of his categorical imperative, which for him is this command. You have to act a certain way. For him, it's the command that what you do be universalizable. Is the rule that I'm operating under something that everyone can do in every circumstance? The common example is lying. We might think it's okay to tell a little lie. Somebody asks you, hey, does my shirt look good? And you don't want to embarrass your friend. So you're like, yeah, it looks great. But for Kant, there's a problem saying that, because you're essentially endorsing the idea that it's all right to lie, which creates a contradiction. We rely on each other all the time to tell the truth, from super benign things. I think I say this in the chapter, but like, hey, what's the time, right? To doctor, how much sedative should I administer to the patient? we rely on each other for truth. And this is just a staple of our lives. So if I lie, I'm simultaneously saying we rely on each other for the truth and we should accept the truth, but also it's okay for me to not tell the truth. And that's a contradiction. Kant says we're rational beings, so we should always act rationally. In this case, that means don't lie.
Okay.
So we demand to act in a certain way. Third thing is Peter Singer. Peter Singer has this argument about essentially why people living in the West should give away almost all of their wealth to the point of what he calls marginal utility. And if they're not willing to do that, to the point that they give away something of moral significance, as he calls it. It's a very simple argument. The first part says, hey, people dying from disease and starvation is bad. 2, we should do what we can to prevent suffering if we don't have to give something up. And these are his premises, and basically everybody accepts these things. I don't know anyone who says, no, it's really great when people die of disease or starve to death. That's awesome. And likewise, there are not many people who say, no, we shouldn't in any way step in to prevent suffering. So he says if we have these two premises, the conclusion is very simple. Okay, then we should do what we can to prevent starvation and death from disease, as long as we are not giving up something morally significant. Again, that's the argument, very simple. Students hate it because they don't know how to respond to it. And the conclusion that he draws from that is, well, the coffee that you're buying or the movies that you're buying or, the Lego on the shelf back here that you have, these are not things that are essential to your life. It's not morally significant if you give these up. So you should be giving up your money in order to help those who are dying of starvation and disease and so on and so forth. So we take all of these three and put them together. And I think this is what the movie is doing. I don't think that McKay is trying to give us this wonderful satire that we're going to laugh at and we're going to have this beautiful time with, and it's going to sweep the Oscars or whatever because it's subtle and brilliant and we could go on. I think he's providing a moral imperative. He wants to inform us of something. So that's the Plato part. Knowing good means doing good. He wants to give us a command. That's from Kant. And he wants to do it in a way that's as straightforward as Singer. So in the movie, he's basically saying that, hey, if some big disaster kills all of us, that's bad. We should do what we can to prevent a disaster like that. And then we have the additional implied premise, which is all the evidence says that climate change, and let me say the scientific evidence says that climate change is going to kill us. It's going to have XYZ negative effect. So you put those three together and you have the conclusion. We should be doing everything we can up to something morally significant, to borrow Singer's, the loss of something morally significant, to borrow Singer's phrasing, to prevent climate change. So I think that's the movie, and I think that's what McKay's doing. And I don't think he cares if we're not laughing our way out of the theater.
I think that was perfectly said. Absolutely. I loved that. I don't even know what to say after that.
I'll tell just a little tag on here, right?
Okay.
One of the things that the last thing that Chris said, that it doesn't care if we're not laughing our way out of the theater, right? And I think that's exactly right. He doesn't care. And if we care about that, so something else that we talk about in the chapter is that a lot of the criticism of the movie seem to not only miss the point of the movie, but to participate in exactly the kind of inane things that the movie was criticizing, right? So I think about an analogy. I'll give you another analogy here. It's going to be working multiple things in here, right? So suppose that in the movie Don't Look Up, right, there was a character who was a movie maker, right? And there was one who made that popcorn movie, Total Devastation. Well, let's say there's another movie maker, but instead of making a popcorn movie, he makes a movie that's an analogy about the comet, right? He makes a movie that's trying to call people to look up and do something about the comet and support doing something about the comet and call the president to do that and da-da-da-da-da, right? And let's say he makes it about a cosmic ray burst, right? That's one of the things that we worry about the sun, cosmic ray burst, and it, burns out electricity or whatever. And let's say he makes it, he calls it Don't Stare at the Sun or something like that, right? But it's a movie that's clearly it's a movie that uses, a cosmic ray burst as an analogy for the threat of the comet that's about to destroy all of humanity, right? If people in film responded to that movie, Don't Look at the Sun, by saying, I'm not sure if its satire is subtle enough. And I really didn't laugh that much at it. And it was maybe poorly acted here and there. And they made these I'm not sure it's going to win an Oscar. And I just wish things were more subtle. And it criticized it in that way. You've totally missed the point of the movie, right? That's not the kind of thing that we should be talking about. When a comet's headed towards Earth, and someone makes a piece of art that says, hey, we should do something about that comet that's headed towards Earth, the appropriate response is not to talk about the artistic quality of the movie. It's to talk about the message of the movie. Maybe we should be doing something about this damn comet, right? Mm-hmm. And the way that people responded to Don't Look Up, and if that happened in movie, they'd be, oh yeah, that's another absurd thing that society does as it responds to the comet, right? Like they want to mine it for minerals. They want to, do all these crazy things. They want to they want to try to fix the problem with giant concerts and that kind of stuff. And when somebody makes a movie about it, they criticize the art instead of talking about the comet, right? But that's exactly what we did with Don't Look Up. Like that's one of the reasons that Don't Look Up is so disturbing, is because it represents exactly what we would do. And that's exactly what we did. We had this movie that was specifically about climate change. And in response to it, instead of talking about climate change, we talked about how subtle the satire was, right? Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I mean, if we go back to Kant, right? So I know this is a movie, and movies can therefore be judged on the merits of movies, whether we're talking about cinematography or its writing. We could just list off all of these things. Well, Kant is writing, let's talk about the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. We can talk about the critique of pure reason, practical reason. Just list off Kant. That's a piece of writing. We could judge it how we would evaluate most pieces of writing, and it's going to fail on most of those.
Mm-hmm,
I can tell you, not just on how my students respond, but we don't like reading Kant, right?
Yeah.
And part of that might have to do with the translation, but it's going to fail in these ways that we are evaluating kind of other pieces of writing. I don't just mean like fiction novels. His sentences aren't always clear. Whatever, pick your criteria, and I think it'll fit here.
And Kant fails, right? Absolutely. Run-on sentences and undefined. It's all over the place. It's very, very, very hard to read.
But Kant's not writing for that reason. Like if it's a categorical imperative, it's a moral command. You must act this way. He's trying to inform us of this so that we make good decisions, and that might be the case with Don't Look Up. It's not ultimately trying to give us something that we can laugh at. That's a great story. That's beautifully written. That's impeccably shot or whatever. It's more, here's a threat, an existential threat, as Kyle has said. I need to inform you of this. Here's what you should be doing about it, your duties or obligations, if you will. And I think that's its purpose.
That's such a great analogy. Anybody who wastes too much time talking about how hard Kant is to read instead of talking about the arguments and the philosophical points he's making is completely missing the point of Kant. Yeah.
Right. I completely agree with that. As you were talking, I was thinking of a criticism that I heard when I was back at college about Kant from one of my co-students, that if we need to be able to hear those elements of it, and yet it's written in such a way that is so difficult, then the failure is actually doing something more than just the failure itself. It's preventing people from getting the message because they can't get past the difficulty in reading it. They check out.
Right.
And that difference, I think, with this movie, if you look at that same analogy, this doesn't have any of that. It's not difficult to get through.
Yeah. It's
straightforward. It's to the point. It hits you upside the head. And, the very end when they're all sitting around having dinner, it's like, I remember I kept waiting for the happy ending. I kept waiting for the part when somebody comes in and saves us all, like you were talking about earlier. but there was that feeling, that sense of anxiety almost, and then it's over and you're like, holy shit, wow. Sometimes that's exactly what we need. We don't need the subtlety. We don't need, so anyway, that's what I was thinking when you were saying that. I don't know if that had anything to do with what, if
you could fault
specifically had to do,
being too hard to understand. Maybe that's
right.
part of the fault. You can fault him for that. Still, if that's what you're talking about, rather than trying to understand them, you're missing the point.
Right.
But you can't criticize Don't Look Up in that way. That's
exactly.
not the problem. It's not as hard. It's not that it's hard to understand. And if you say, well, it's too easy to understand, well, you're really going off course there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So we have about 5 minutes left in our show. And so I really wanted to get kind of both of your sum up. How do you want our viewers to take the Don't Look Up, and how do you want them to take that into their life, into the work that we do? What I'm trying to get at, earlier you said at the very beginning, yes, we can't really do a whole lot. We have to have the upper echelon to do that. We need to have the power structure because we don't have the resources, the power, and so forth. But at the same time, we need to still be aware, and we need to make the right choices to get that power structure up there, right? So what do you want us, in that same vein, what is kind of the tie-up of this movie and climate change and our future, if that makes sense, what I'm trying to say?
Right. You want me to go first so you can have the last word, Chris? That's how I was thinking.
I mean, I don't have to have the last word, but sure, whatever you'd like to do. Okay.
I don't know. So on the one hand, it'd be nice to give you the last word. On the other hand, I might step on your toes and not step on your toes, but like say what you're going to say and then everything. So I don't know. I mean, I think I'm going to say the same thing I said at the end of the last show, which is, you need to do all the things that you could personally do, like all the people that we're talking about, all the different wonderful things they're doing at the beginning of the show. Yes, do all of those things, but also recognize that it's not enough. And even collectively, it's not going to be enough. We have to have overarching governmental cooperation and action to do something about this. And the only way that's going to happen is if two things happen. A, you get people in office, in positions of power, not only in office, but in positions of power everywhere, who think this is real and care about it, right? And are scientifically informed, et cetera, et cetera. And then B, you got to put pressure on them to take major action and do something about it, right? And that means like voting the right people in, making this, I think it should be everyone's number one priority. That this should be like the main and perhaps the only voting issue that you have is, does the person care about and is going to do something about climate change, right? And then B, once they're in there, hold them accountable for doing what they said they were going to do, right? And so to me, that's like when the movie makes the argument, you need to do everything that you can to do about this. That's the main things. And so that's what we've got to be doing. Chris?
I was hoping you were going to address the systemic part of things because, yeah, absolutely. I want to come at it then from the pop culture side of things and say, because I saw people talking in the chat about this too, like, well, how are we going to have real life discussion with people? Certainly talk about that. That should be number one, the systemic. This is a systemic issue. It's not just an individual issue. Yes, we should be doing what we can as individuals, but the real change comes from systemic change. My suggestion, especially as far as real life discussion goes, is going to be in the direction of like, it's okay for our media to do things like this. It's okay for us to evaluate our media differently. And sometimes a piece of media may just be a hammer upside the head telling you, you need to do this. You need to be aware of it. Or as Jesus Tales said earlier, you need to wake up. And that would be something that I would put into an everyday discussion, right? A movie isn't just there to be entertaining. It's also not just there to be this puzzle box of aesthetic, I don't know, whatever that you have to unravel. Maybe it's also a piece of art that is screaming in your ear, and that's okay too. So I think telling people that and helping them to come around to that idea might be good, because I do believe that people are resistant to that idea.
Yeah. And I feel like you can, talking about way to have conversations with people. I mean, you don't have to do it this way, obviously, but Don't Look Up could be that that weigh in, right? Like, oh, let's watch the movie, let's watch Don't Look Up, and then have a conversation about it, right? Let me relay a very strange thing that conveys a couple of messages. One is that the movie apparently is not as subtle as some people, or as overt as some people say it is. On my way to driving, where I go to work, there, I'm not going to give the name, but there's a garage that's on the main avenue here, and it is Trump headquarters. They put out giant Trump signs. They have, like, they sell merch whenever he's anywhere near town. And they have these big giant signs that they pay to put on this business that are like, I miss the days of men before, or ladies before men. And, and men and women sports, and like, they have all that stuff. Right. And
women know which bathroom to use. Sorry.
Yeah. Like it's a lot of that stuff. I mean, big signs, like big signs that are as big as, like, they hang above a garage. Right. Like, and I went by one day and they had a sign that said, "Watch the movie Don't Look Up. You can figure it out." And I was like, I know these people are climate change deniers. That's unquestionable. The climate change deniers, right? And so clearly they missed the point.
They sure as hell did.
But they still like the movie. They still like the movie. Now, I do not know these people, so this is not something that I can engage with them or whatever. But if you have denying friends, right, like, they might key into Don't Look Up. They might look at it and understand that it's saying something about our society. And then a conversation about it might lead them to realize that, well, what it's actually talking about is climate change. And the thing it's criticizing is the thing that you do with climate change, right? Like, it might be able to break through in that kind of way. But again, maybe not, but that might at least be a way to do that. So
you just gave me a whole brain aneurysm right there. My brain exploded there. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've actually had students do that. Like, what Kyle is describing has happened. When the movie came out, students are coming into class. I was teaching a film and philosophy class at the time, and they're like, "Hey, there's this movie," and they were describing kind of what they thought about it. And I did spend part of a class session breaking down some of the ideas that we've discussed today on the podcast. So that's a really good point, Kyle.
Cool.
That was it. My brain is now going in 100,000 different places. But I do want to say one thing. You said that you have that garage that you go by that has all that stuff. Be glad that's all you have is the garage, because what you were describing is where I live, and it's everywhere. It's not just one garage. We had you remember the Trump train? Mm-hmm. It came right past my country road house. I mean, it was like right here, and they kept doing it over and over. So, yeah, we're on that.
We've had that as well. We've had those kind of things here as well. The valley I live in, a lot of people talked about, is what flipped the election in 2016. That the Wyoming Valley here that we're in flipped for Obama in 2008, and that's what gave Obama Pennsylvania. And this valley flipping back Republican in 2016 is what handed Pennsylvania to Trump in 2016, and that was the tipping point. That's what put him over the electoral win. And so there were a lot of people here in 2016 going, "What in the world happened? You guys all voted for Obama 4 years ago." And so it could very likely happen again here too. I think that the state might turn actually on Wyoming Valley, because basically all the rest of the state and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh kind of cancel each other out, and then you've got the valley in the middle here, and it swings all the time.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So what I want to say is I appreciate so much this discussion. I'm so glad that we decided to have a part 2 and really focus on this. Last week's was fantastic, but we were trying to do too much in that one, I think we saw, and splitting it up like this allowed us to really dive in a way that it's even hard with a 1 hour show with this. But I'm just so thankful that you guys decided to do this. If you guys in the audience enjoy it as much as I do, there's a couple ways that you can make sure that this continues to happen, and we have great guests like this. you can do the easy way, like, subscribe, share, hit the bell, all those cool things that you guys hear us talking about all the time. But it really does make a difference. Comment on the show later on. That makes a difference as well. But if you want to do something a little more, think maybe you might want to become a patron. And Wes, if you can put up that ticker, because I just realized I don't have it in front of me. If you will put up the ticker for me, I would like to thank our patrons. Wait a minute, he must not be. Oh, there he is. Woo! Whew. Paul Kamish, Karen Butcher, Puck, Helen Green, Logan Fisher, Amanda McLeod, Eric Ozols, Ryan, Deneen Murphy, Dan D, Michael Wiseman, me, Aaron Coalson, and Phil Calderone. You guys keep the lights on, and we do truly appreciate that. I want to let you know that we always have the ability for you to help us with volunteering. If you want to volunteer, let us know. Just email wessturdivant@gmail.com, and he will put you to work. Let me tell you, he puts people to work, and they love it. Also, as the ticker is saying, we have all kinds of other great shows. And we have a brand new show that's coming on. It just started on Mondays. It's the Black Freethinkers, and let me tell you what, it's awesome. It is so good. You guys want to check that out. Tuesdays is Secular Soapbox. Thursdays are spent with me, and aren't you glad? Saturdays is the Global Atheist and Women Atheist Unload. And then on Sunday, we have our call-in show where you can call in and talk to great people. We've had some awesome shows. So be sure and check all those out. We have something for everyone here at Secular Haven. So I want everyone to join me again next week. And in the meantime, remember to think critically. Good night, everybody.
Part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return. And we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along.